welcome to the Nordic Mythology podcast. I'm Daniel Farrand of the company Hans Voden. And as always, before we jump into the show, I do have to plug our Patreon. It's how we keep the lights on. It's how we keep the podcast going. So if you do want to support us, please go and check out Patreon/Nordic Mythology podcast. You get a bunch of bonus episodes every month. We do Q&As with the guests after every episode, which are a lot of fun. There's a ton of questions that me and Mags miss. There's a lot of wealth and knowledge to be had in each of those. And you get the whole back catalogue. So from the moment you subscribe, you get years of material from before. So you don't just get moving forward. So there's tons of stuff you can go back and listen to. If you have an episode that you liked, there's probably accompanying Q&A that goes with it, where you can just learn a bunch of stuff. It's like a little extension. And then on a more fun note, you get the story time episodes that we do with Jonas Lorentzen, and then the ones we do with Claire Moulet as well, which are always a lot of fun. And then our creator episodes. Basically, there's just a ton of stuff. Just go over to Patreon/Nordic Mythology podcast. Go check it out. It starts from £3 a month, which is like, it's cheaper than buying me a cup of coffee. Coffee's expensive these days. So if you ever think, I'd love to buy down a cup of coffee, I like the podcast, then there you go. Just go and do that instead, please. And it does help us out. But let's jump into today's show. So as always, I'm going to start saying as always again. I'm joined by the lovely and our in-house archaeologist, because that's the new title for Margrethe. I was going to for Mags.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's nice to be back.
So for a little bit of context, before I agreed that I was going to succumb to just saying Mags, because I fuck the name up every time.
You don't fuck the name up. I just have a very I don't have a very internationally pronounceable name, is the thing.
Yeah.
Unlike our guest today, who has a very internationally pronounceable name. Because we are joined by Tim Hertogh. Did I get it right? Or just
Hertogh? So the first name is internationally pronounceable, I guess.
Yeah. Your last name isn't that hard. You're actually our second Dutch guest in a row. Because last week we were joined by the overdressed archaeologist. I'm not even going to try to say her name off the top of my head, but she has fun.
Yeah, don't even. That was a great episode, though, so do go and listen to that.
Yeah, but Tim, you're a PhD candidate at the University of Oslo in history. So we're actually colleagues, and we kind of know each other a little bit from before. So I'm really excited about this episode. Do you want to tell us a bit about what you do, what your interests are?
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for inviting me. This is gonna be really fun, I think.
Absolutely.
As you mentioned, I'm a PhD student at the University of Oslo. I work there as a part of the Minitext project, which is this big European-funded project where 10 people are researching all the Latin texts that are written in the margins and minute spaces of all their manuscripts. And what I do specifically there is I look at the charms and incantations. And even more specifically, I look at the animal charms and incantations. So bees, worms, horses, pigs, cows, and how using the power of words, people were trying to influence those animals. And broadly speaking, geographically, this is not very Nordic. It's also not very mythological. But why I do think it's very interesting for the listeners of your podcast is because some of these texts have been used to make a bunch of arguments about Germanic paganism and Nordic paganism, which I think is something we'll get into more today.
Yeah.
Ooh, I had no idea it was niche. Also, first of all, stellar PhD project, just niche the niche down into an even smaller niche. I love it. But that's so cool that it's specifically dealing with charms relating to animals.
Yeah, well, that was a later development after finding out that there were way more charms in Latin than I'd expected there to be.
That sounds familiar.
because people have always been interested in charms, but people are usually interested in the vernacular material, so Old English, Old High German, Old Saxon, and the Latin stuff gets neglected a bit. So before starting the PhD, I thought, I'll be able to do the Latin stuff, and there was way more stuff than I could have imagined before.
So for those of us that don't or I haven't done a PhD, is it better just to have something super niche? Like when you started this and you found there was so many more charms than you expected. Why is that a problem? Why is that not like a good thing, I guess?
Well, because we only have 3 years. So
That sounds like a long time to me. I've always
oh,
thought this
that is
when it's
not a
like
long time for a PhD. In the US, I think people take 6 years. In the Netherlands, it's quite normal to take 4 or 5 years. But in general, the idea of a PhD being niche is because you need to have an answer, and you need to have a question that you're able to answer in those years, and that you're able to answer with at least some precision. And adding something to the scientific debate as someone who's basically just a student is already hard enough. But trying to do that about the entirety of the history of magic is, of course, not going to be possible in that time. So that's why people go for super niche things where you're actually able to say something new, which I guess Margrethe is probably also doing.
Yeah, and I feel like you and I are have had similar experiences that where it doesn't necessarily have to start out super niche. A caveat, super niche in relation to the given field you're in. So maybe niche to the everyday person on the street, but doesn't necessarily have to be super niche within the field that you're working with. But what it sounds like both Tim and I have experienced that we had this idea, started out, and then we were like, oh shit, there's way more here than I thought there was to be able to complete this in the allotted time before my paycheck runs out. I need to make some hard decisions, or not necessarily hard decisions, but more like specific decisions to be able to say something about this.
So could you not just submit one on like a more broad, in like broad strokes? Does it? Because like I say, I've never done a PhD. So can you not kind of cover a more broad subject in like a wider variety rather than having to like be super particular about certain things? Or is that the whole point of a PhD, that it has to go into like the real nuance and kind of intricacies?
Yeah, well, that you can have a very broad question, but you're gonna need to be able to answer that question. So you could, for instance, have a huge question about, I don't know, did people when we see old High German texts in manuscripts? Well, that's going to be a very specific question again. Did monks know multiple languages, for instance?
Okay.
How many languages did monks know? And then you can pick, for instance, 6 case studies from different places in Europe, and you have a very broad question, but you still, in order to be able to answer it, you're going to need something that you're going to be able to compact in some sense. So people will do case studies quite often to answer broader questions. But then still the research you're doing, at least in my field, I'm not sure if it's the same in archaeology, but it's gonna be quite detailed quite often. Even though you could also go for, I know someone who's trying to write a master's thesis now on charms, looking at like a much larger corpus and then trying to see developments over time based on linguistic elements and stuff, which then you can, of course, then the thing you're using those sources for is still very niche, but you're using a wider set of sources, I guess.
It is fascinating from like an outsider's perspective. Do they have to be unique? And I know this isn't a podcast about PhDs, but I was just kind of
now that you have 2 of us here, you might as well ask the questions you've been wondering about.
I just want to, do they have to be unique? Because obviously, with it being a niche question, is there like a thing where you could cover the same topic maybe someone else has, but you don't agree with it?
Yeah,
possibly? That's
what happens most often. I'd say what you try to do is the idea of writing a PhD thesis is that you're adding on to an already existing discussion. So for instance, were charms pagan or something? Then some people say, yes, they were very pagan. Some other people say, no, they were very not pagan. And then you try to say something new about that based on either the sources that already exist, but because you're using a different angle, or you're comparing them to different sources, or because you have new sources. So you're always discussing stuff with other people. So you're always building forward on something already existing, but you're trying to do a new thing with it. So in that sense, it's unique, but it's also not that unique.
So you're basically trying to add, like you're trying to not broaden as in like the physical sense, but you're trying to broaden and increase the knowledge already existing there, or provide new knowledge to an already existing thing. So like, trying to provide maybe nuance or new insight, or be like, there has to be some sort of new knowledge being produced.
So, does there get a point, again, this might be a complete wild thought, does there become a point where you kind of, or it's possible to run out of topics, and then I guess people try to
I love how Tim and I have the exact same smirk going on right now. No, go ahead, Dan.
Because what I'm thinking is, would it be possible that, or certainly maybe around the most popular topics, where people would try and find a new angle that maybe doesn't necessarily exist, but they're kind of forced to have to find some new thing for the PhD, so they kind of like maybe push an idea that isn't super popular. Maybe does that make sense of what I'm trying to get to? Is in like, maybe they just take like an angle on something that they're maybe even not that convinced on, but with this pressure to find like a new angle on something. Could that ever be a thing, or is it just there's too much?
I would say, first of all, there's way too much source material already. Like, there is so much stuff that we, like, for instance, the stuff I do my research on is not even edited, most of it. So it's still in the manuscripts. So it's not typed down by anyone. It's definitely not translated. And then you're going to have to look at it. But even if we knew all of the sources, even if all of them were discussed in huge detail, I mean, you see it with something like the sagas, right? Like, everyone probably listening to this podcast even knows those things by heart, and still there's new and newer and newer research being published on it, because at least for history, because the times now are changing, the way we look at history also changes, so it always requires new research in that sense.
Yeah, I'd say the thing you said right there definitely applies to archaeology as well. It's not just about what's already been produced, but it's also like, oh, but we ask different questions now.
Yeah.
So if we ask this question or these questions instead of the questions that have already been asked, then what answers do we end up with?
I feel like I can't shake this stigma that I've had, and I've had it from day one of this podcast, of this idea that there is just some centralized database of information where everything is already translated and it's easily accessible. And I can see both of your faces.
What if that would have been the case? That would have been awesome.
That would have been great. Like, that would have saved me so much work.
Bro, same.
But I think for a layperson, we kind of just are like, why does that not exist? Why is there not this
because
one?
We don't get enough money, Dan. That's
Thank you, Tim. Everyone give Tim a round of applause. That was the correct answer.
Absolutely. But that is, but I think as for most lay people just not in the scholarly world at all, we just kind of had this idea, or certainly for me, I can't speak for everyone, or I used to have this idea that I'm surely everything just goes into like one place and everyone can just type in like a Google for scholars, where you can just type in and find what you need. And then when I used to do the show with Matthias Nordvig, he was like, "No, that doesn't exist. That's not a real thing." Like, and just gave me the same look that you two gave me of like just absolute dismay. Like, no, that's not real. And it's like, but why? Why can't
we're trying to do it? So that's something we're doing with the mini text database. Is we're trying to put all of these additions to manuscripts, of things that were written in margins and in flyleaves, so protective covers of books. We're trying to make transcriptions of all of those texts and put them into a database. But that would still require you to know Latin and, be able to read these texts and stuff. But at least it's becoming more accessible than it only lying in libraries and being written in awful handwriting that you're gonna need to
decipher before you even get to ask the question you want to ask.
Yeah.
I imagine this is a place that AI could really help if put in correctly. I imagine it could really make leaps and bounds.
The answer here is yes, and with manuscript, not with these mini texts, because they are so short and the hands differ so much that AI doesn't do much there. But there are wonderful transcribers. I wouldn't know how to pronounce that in English, but there's
Transcribers?
Transcribers. There's a wonderful AI tool that at least I know for early modern handwriting and probably for much medieval handwriting can already transcribe that. And of course, wonderful software like DeepL exists that's getting better and better at translating. But you're still going to need to, like, when you're trying to decipher abbreviations in manuscripts, AI can tell us only so much, because even a perfect paleographer cannot deduce from all of the abbreviations what they mean, because it's going to depend on context, it's going to depend on other similar texts. But yes, I think AI is going to be, especially in a decade or two, it's going to be very, very useful for material like this.
Okay, let's actually get to the topic of the show. So we said Mag said before the show that we like to tangent, and I guess the first what's it been, like 15 minutes has just been. Without going on too much of another tangent, happy May 17th.
Thank you.
Yeah, for anybody that doesn't know, Margrethe, do you want to give like a little rundown of what it is quickly?
Well, May 17th is pretty much the Norwegian 4th of July, except it's not for independence. It's for the Constitution. A bunch of dudes gathered on May 17th, 1814, and signed a document. We were currently at that point under Sweden or Denmark. Sweden and Denmark did like trade-offs with us for a while there. Anywho, we got together. I said we, except I would not have been included in that meeting because, you know, woman. But basically we made our own constitution, and ever since then we've celebrated May 17th because we got our own constitution. So it's our Constitution Day. Everyone's out and about eating ice cream and hot dogs and in our national costumes if we have one, and it's pretty great.
It is a lot of fun. I got to experience it last year. And yeah, it's lovely. It's very, because we don't have anything like that as a Brit. We just don't have that experience. Like for us, it's just not a
well,
thing.
You know, you were the colonizer.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Okay, let's not go into that too much.
I'm just putting it out there.
But we don't have that. So as a Brit to go and experience it, it was really lovely. Except that you have your national like clothing, and you wear it on some of like the hottest days, and I don't quite understand that, because it is, the clothes look really heavy and really beautiful, but it's also really fucking hot.
Well, the thing is, I guess the short answer to that before we get into Tim's thing is global warming. It didn't always used to be this hot on the 17th of May. This year, it pushed up to 30 degrees, and I walked around all day wearing a gown made of wool. And also all the weight in that gown sits in your shoulders. So I have actual blisters on my shoulders from wearing that gown from 7 in the morning until 1 in the morning.
Nice.
Yep.
But they are beautiful. So
they're pretty great. You feel really fancy walking around.
Yeah, good. Okay, now let's finally get into the topic of the show, which you touched on, is charms and incantations. Did you say from Latin texts?
Yeah, so I look mostly at Latin texts, but some of the most famous ones are in Old High German and in Old Saxon, so I kind of have to look at those as well.
Okay, let's start with what probably is a very broad question, but what is a charm and what is an incantation?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, as is often the case with academics, this is already the hardest question you could ask.
Dan's really good at that. He just like, let me just ask this intro question, and he just hits
I think we could have 3 podcasts discussing this, but I think I should keep it really brief. The way I see a charm, incantation, spell, these words are being used interchangeably. They mean different things to different people. I would say it's a string of words or symbols that try, like, by saying them or writing them down, you try to achieve a certain practical purpose. So through the power of words. And the difference here between an incantation and a prayer, as far as you can make that difference, I have seen academics try to argue that the difference is a prayer requests something from a higher being, and an incantation directly tries to change something in without asking God for help. You can use God's power, but you're not asking God. So a prayer would be, "Oh God, help me with my bees." And an incantation would be, "By the power of God, I command the bees to do X, Y, Z." And this
Okay.
is very simplified. That I don't
Sure.
think this distinction is very relevant to early medieval people, but it is something to work with.
Mhm. See, so I again, I can only speak for myself and my own kind of thoughts. For me, an incantation, I always just automatically would associate with like a pagan or a witch. I would never put it in like a Christian or like a religious context. I
Yeah.
wouldn't think of like a prayer to be an incantation. But then
And I
that's
think
kind of,
that's gonna be wonderful because I am gonna read, if you like, I'm gonna read some fun examples, and there you're
Ooh,
gonna see
yes.
it's
how
not, it's
hard
not
it's
gonna
gonna
like
be to
curses, is
make
it?
these differences. It's not gonna be curses, but there are. I mean, let's start with a really fun example that I'm sure maybe your audience even knows, and I hope you know. It's the Nesso charm. So if you know the artist Hailung, right?
Yes. Yeah.
They have a wonderful song. They have the song Nesso. And
Hmm.
in the song Nesso, all they do is recite this wonderful Nesso charm or Nesso incantation.
Oh wow.
And I think I should wait. Can I? I think I can. I think I should read it so we get an image of what it is, what we're talking about when I'm talking about
Hmm.
charms, right? It's a really short one. So it's this one it's from the 9th or 10th century. It's written in the margins of an older manuscript, and we have two different versions of it that are quite similar. Okay, so quote: "Against worms, go out, Nesso, with your 9 Nessiklinon, out from the marrow into the bone, out from the bone into the flesh, out from the flesh into the skin, and out from the skin into this arrow. Lord, may it happen thus."
Okay.
I'm sure I raised more questions than I answered them. But as you can imagine, with a text like this, there are so many different interpretations of text like these. Ideas about what are the worms, what is the Nesso, what is the arrow, is this a local Germanic pagan tradition? Is this something weird related to other kinds of mythologies? And these are questions I like to look at. But what I mostly try to do is I try to place it within the early medieval medical context. So by showing different examples that are similar to this, I try to make it all a bit less pagan and scary and dangerous, and a bit more logically early medieval medicine
Hmm.
in a way.
Okay. Um, is a is a charm more of like a? I'm trying to just pull it back to before that, just to kind of clear up my understanding of like each word. Would it is a charm more of like a drawing and an incantation would be words, or can they both be interchangeable for each? Because I guess for a charm, in the way you kind of described it, I automatically think of like an Icelandic stave, like
Yeah,
a drawing of a symbol or a
yeah.
sigil, and I would assume that is that a charm?
Yeah, I mean that's also a charm, but charms are also used in the literature to refer to things that you would think about more as incantations. And the reason for that is that primarily in later medieval sources, the word charm or charme in French is quite often placed above them, which comes from the Latin carmen
Oh.
for song or poem, uh, which then develops into the English word charm, which then also gets the connotation that you have with it, which is of course,
Yeah.
especially in modern English, completely a correct one.
Right, yeah, because again, like I would associate it with like a charm bracelet, like
Yeah,
a physical image of something rather
yeah,
than maybe like a written text. But it seems like originally it could quite easily be like a written
yeah.
thing.
I mean, if you look at the academic literature, that's what the word charm will most often be used for. But precisely because of this confusion, I prefer to use incantation
Hmm.
because I think it's clearer what I mean than when I say charm, because then people will, especially people who aren't working on this stuff day and night will usually have a different association with it when you say the word charm.
But I also think it's nice because I know, at least from Scandinavian context, you also have all of these little physical things like amulets with incantations on them, and they're often referred to either as amulets or charms. So it's also nice to have that distinction where you're looking specifically at manuscripts.
Yeah.
Oh,
cool. But I mean, that sounds so visceral, like calling the worms. I'm thinking of like the kind of, my immediate thought was those kind of parasites that you could get. Like, it sounds like it's trying to pull, like, it gave me, it was like reminiscent of, it's not the same thing, but it was reminiscent of like a verbal version of like bloodletting.
Yeah.
Or like leeching, like pulling something out of the body.
And
but
I think
just here with the words instead of a physical object.
Yeah, and I think you're completely right here. I think the idea that incantations are combined with other medical practices like bloodletting is a very realistic notion. What is exactly meant by worms, though, is a wonderful rabbit hole we could get into if you'd like. It is.
Sure.
There is.
Please give us all the nuance, Tim.
Yes. So there is a bunch. There are many discussions about what exactly these worms are, right? So the idea used to be more wild ideas used to be that these are Germanic pagan demon worms that are somehow related to the Midgard serpent and all kinds of wild interpretations like these. Now, these ideas are interesting, but they aren't based on early medieval medicine. Because if you look at early medieval medicine, worms are everywhere, and they're used as descriptors of certain diseases. And I'm not entirely sure how often these are seen as literal worms, how often they're seen as metaphorical worms, and how often they are seen as just a way of describing the disease. A wonderful example of this is that certain swellings on that go over your body that look like a worm is crawling through them, they are called the worm disease. And you have the same thing as something that is called the mole disease, the talpa in Latin, because it creates swellings on your head that look like molehills.
Right.
So what exactly is meant by adjuring a worm isn't always as clear as you may. It doesn't have to be.
As my 21st century brain assumed.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I mean, it could be, and I think in certain contexts it certainly is, but in other contexts, the word worm or vermis in Latin is definitely not used to talk about a real worm. It's used to talk about a disease that looks like it could have been caused by a worm.
What about? I guess what comes to mind would be, I guess, like veins. Would they, not understanding what a vein is it possible that could be a relation to like a worm? You know, the kind of look.
Yeah, I get what you mean. I mean, I don't think so, but that kind of mindset does certainly work. So, for instance, one I really like is toothache and holes you get in teeth. With your toothache, they are being ascribed to worms because the idea is that small little animals must be crawling through your teeth and causing these kind of holes in there.
Like they would be in an apple.
Yeah. It's a logic that kind of makes sense. And also because the word worm here, or vermis in Latin, doesn't necessarily only mean worm. The English word vermin we get from the same word vermis. So it's talking about all kinds of small intestinal little beings. The wonderful encyclopedia by Isidore from the 6th century, I think, contains about 2 or 3 pages of him discussing everything that could be classified as a vermis, as a worm.
Oh wow!
Is there any link to, I guess in Nordic mythology, like worms always are related to like the dragon type figures? Is there any kind of link over to that as like a more of like a powerful creature, or does Latin kind of the way that the linguistics split, it doesn't follow that same route?
Well, these incantations are actually in Old Saxon and in Old High German. So they're not in Latin. They use the word vermis to describe the disease. But then they don't mention a variation of the word worm after that. I don't think they have anything to do with mythological ideas like those. But there are people that would like to make arguments like those, which I don't think hold much.
Feels like you're trying to be really nice there.
Being very diplomatic. I mean, I just want to throw this out there just to see how you react, Tim. And you don't have to agree or disagree. You don't even have to comment on it. But I guess not having a mythological context, sure, but these being 9th to 10th century manuscripts, correct?
Well, the manuscripts are older, but the editions are from the 9th or 10th.
Oh,
well,
okay.
Later
all right.
9th
Well,
century, yeah.
Then my little thought here might not apply necessarily, but assuming that they were written in a Christian context, which I assume that they were, the question could be asked. I guess this would maybe fall into what you described as a potentially wild interpretation, but I assume that one kind of association with the word worm in a Christian context would be the snake in the Garden of Eden, kind of like the bad stuff.
Yeah.
That isn't great.
Yeah.
The devilry. Get the devilry out of the body.
Well, so there's actually a really wonderful example of an incantation that not to this story in the Bible, but a different story in the Bible. In the book of Job, Job gets tormented by a whole bunch of different diseases that God sends upon him. And one of the diseases he sends is described in the Hebrew Bible as a word that could be interpreted as worm. It's not translated to worm in the Latin Vulgate Bible, but it is interpreted as such by a bunch of biblical interpreters, among them Augustine, the famous church father. And this leads to a bunch of worm incantations that will actually adjure the worms, saying Job was tormented by worms, just as God freed Job of the worms. So should you be rid of your dangerous worms in your body. So that is the use of historiolas is what they're called. So little stories from mostly the Bible, but also different kind of legends. Is definitely a way you can get rid of a whole bunch of different diseases, which is always really fascinating.
Huh.
Are there incantation? Because it seems like the ones you mentioned so far are, I guess, in like a healing kind of situation.
Yeah.
Are there ones where they would be used to maybe just try and achieve something external, rather than like, I want to heal me or this person?
Yes.
Like, we were going to do an incantation to gain something.
So I'll read another really fun one if you'll allow me. It's not an animal incantation, but it is the one I like to tell people at parties most often, because I'm excited now. I think it's a really, really funny one. This incantation is found in an 11th century manuscript, which is the Mudino Rotulus, which is a 6 meter long scroll that you can still find rolled up in the library of Bern. Now it was produced somewhere around Moorbach, most likely, which is in the modern day Alsace. And it contains a whole bunch of medical remedies, but also some really fun, broader practical remedies. And let's see if I can find the quote. Otherwise, I think I almost know. Yes, so here it is. If you want your wife to tell the truth about adultery while she is asleep, you should write down the names Iohel, Deomedius, Eugenius, Probatus, Sabatus, Stephanus, Kyriacus. You should write them down on a piece of parchment and place it between the woman's breasts while she is sleeping. Then she will name all of her adulterers or all of her lovers. Which I think is a really fun example. And we're all laughing about it because it looks weird to us. Mm-hmm. But if you actually dissect, most incantations are built up out of different building blocks with different kind of traditions that at some point come together. And if you try to do that with an incantation like this, you actually start understanding the logic behind it. Because already in ancient Egypt, we find a few texts that mention that you should place the paw of a bird between the woman's breast while she is sleeping. So this tradition of placing something between the woman's breast while she is sleeping and having her confess things is something that is already established in antiquity, and that makes its way into later medieval Europe. And then these really weird names that you have to write down are actually the names of the seven sleepers, which are a bunch of Christian saints that were once buried in a cave in Ephesus and then slept for 200 years. But then they woke up, so they fell asleep in a pagan world and they woke up in a now Christian world. So there's this association of power given by God during sleep. And by kind of combining these two elements, this person is trying to, have someone confess, have someone help find out whether or not their wife committed adultery, which I think is really wonderful.
What an odd way to. I wonder how many people tried it. I would love to know how many people actually tried it, and furthermore, how many people got caught in the act of trying this, because this can't be an easy thing to do. You've got to get pretty, you've got to write the little thing out beforehand, but then while she's sleeping, you've got to like try and sneak it in there. And I guess you got to like, do you leave it in there and then she speaks while she's asleep and tells you all the names, or and then you have to like take it out so she doesn't know in the morning?
Well, so Dan, I actually think, I mean, again, I tell this to people at parties because quite often people, when I tell them I'm doing my PhD research on charms and incantations, they don't really know what that means. So I've quite often had people ask me whether or not I am empirically trying to test whether or not these incantations work. Which I think is...
Oh no, what have you subjected your girlfriend to, Tim?
So what I've told people is that people will ask me, do any of them work? And I will tell them, this incantation I just told you, that this is what I think actually works. In the sense that if you place it between let's say we have a very insecure husband in early medieval Europe, and he isn't happy with this relationship, and he's scared that his wife committed adultery. So he goes to a priest and he tells him, Mr. Priest, I'm so worried about my wife committing adultery. And then the priest writes this down on a piece of parchment. He gives it to the man. The man places it between the woman's breasts while she is sleeping, and the woman doesn't say anything. Well, then, of course, you know that your wife has not committed adultery.
And then you can live happily ever
and
after.
Then you can live happily ever after. So I would say in that sense, this incantation actually works.
It's an ego patting exercise is what it is.
I mean, I am also just, maybe people just had different kind of sensory experiences or like interpret things differently. Maybe you wouldn't be shaken or like woken that easily. But I am just also impressed at the level of stealth required for this feat, because I am fairly sure that I would have woken up if someone tried to slip a piece of parchment between my boobs when I was sleeping. I'd be like, hey, what? Hey, what's up? You want to have a conversation, maybe?
I would assume that I mean, I don't know, but I would assume most people weren't sleeping completely naked back then either. But maybe they were. I don't know. I'm not sure. Would it not be too cold? Would they?
I mean, it didn't say that it had to be underneath any sort. It didn't say it had to touch the skin, though. That's kind of an inference that we made. So it could be on the outside. See, this is the podcast, Tim. We go into the details. We're like, but how practically would you kind of go about this endeavor?
Well, and let's tie this in then to it actually getting a bit more into the academic way, because of course this question, people are asking this question not about this incantation specifically, but people are asking the question, did people actually use these texts? Why were they writing them down because they just thought they were interesting, or were they writing them down because they were actually using them? And I think the answer here is that people are actually using them. And I think one of the most convincing arguments for that is that sometimes you'll find charms written down in the lower or upper margins of manuscripts. So imagine a book in the upper or lower margin, people are writing down incantations. And then those same manuscripts will have in those exact spaces parts of the margins missing because they've been cut out.
Oh, wow.
So I think that actually shows that people are producing amulets out of manuscript margins, maybe to find out if your wife has committed adultery, maybe to heal a horse, maybe to keep your bees in a certain place. So that actually shows the wonderful history of active use with these super fascinating texts.
Oh, I love that. But also
Okay.
love how you took an incantation that's like on face value, especially to us today, is a bit like, ugh, bro, is that an okay thing to do? But then you twist it into something that almost becomes kind of wholesome. With like, if the wife then doesn't say something, then the husband can be at
I
peace.
mean,
I mean,
again,
it's
that's
still
not
toxic
very
as fuck,
academic, but
but
I think it's a fun way of thinking. I
yeah.
mean, thinking about the what people call the social logic of these texts. So why, how could something like this work, and how could something, at least thinking from our minds, be useful? This same part of the manuscript is also filled with a bunch of, I would say, other confidence boosters. So that you better sell your wares, you need to write down a bunch of uh, magical signs, let's call them, or to make sure that your enemies turn into your friends, or to make sure that as a fisherman you'll catch more fish.
Mm-hmm.
So a bunch of these kind of, I mean, lucky charms, I guess, is a word we still use
Yeah.
for similar ideas.
People just never change, do they? It's just like people are people, and they're, I guess, insecure and try and find ways. Going back, okay, I'm not leaving the one in between the breasts just yet. Do you do you think that it could also, because I have this idea that probably men throughout history have just found ways to kind of do what they want and get out of things. So do you think they, whilst
Can
it
I just
seems,
what's up with the gender determinism, Dan? Haven't we already been through this a couple times?
how do you mean?
I nope, go. Men always like the men through time. What you assume would be men. I'm just saying. Just like
Oh, okay. Um, yeah, I'm just making it simple.
I'm just learning from Mariana from a couple episodes back where she took you to task. So I'm just like learning and bringing
Okay,
it.
okay. But so I think, could it also was it could be like more wholesome in sense of, oh, if she says nothing, then I mean, she's not done anything. But could it also be a case of nobody else is really there? If he does manage to, maybe he doesn't even slip the thing in between the boobs, he just kind of holds it near, and then just in the morning just says, you know what? She said a bunch of names. This thing works. Um, she's clearly an adulterer. Like, nobody can check. So could it be used and twisted in that
Well,
way?
of course, but I just think you have a more pessimistic view of the past than I do,
Maybe,
Dan.
maybe, yeah. I just feel like it's open to abuse for like all these things
Well,
are.
yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, you could always use certain instruments for good or for bad reasons, of course.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I can't help but think that men, or those identifying as men, if that's okay, Max,
Sure.
would would just it feels like it's too, as shit as it sounds, like too easy to like
Okay, but
use.
here I also want to cut in and say I wouldn't have an issue with what you're saying if you also just said people, because I think you're giving, if we're doing the two sex thing, women a lot more credit than credit is deserved, because women have also been known to be assholes throughout human history. So I think if
Yeah,
something's up to be kind of, I'm really pushing the agenda here, girls. I'm really, team player here. But I think people, regardless of age, sex, or gender, have also been known to abuse situations that could be abused and also to make the best out of it,
But
regardless.
nevertheless, it is really fast. We have multiple variations of this incantation. And as I mentioned, not necessarily just this incantation, but also placing certain stones between the woman's breasts while she is sleeping, and all these kinds of. In the Hebrew Bible contains a wonderful adultery test for women. So I think there is a sense here. There is a super interesting gender question here
That's
of
true. That's
why
true.
it is only relevant for that the women are committing adultery and not that the men are committing adultery, of course. At least I don't know of any charms or rituals trying to find out whether or not a husband has committed adultery.
Oh,
I wonder, and this might not be relevant to what we're talking about at all, but I wonder if it comes back to the reproductive question. It's like if a woman has a kid, there is no question up until modern times that that child is biologically hers or theirs regarding a person. The person giving birth is one of the parents of that child.
mhm.
There's no if, buts, or doubts about it. But the other parentage is up for debate, I guess.
Yeah, and I
So I
mean,
wonder if it comes back to that.
in the manuscript context, this actually would make sense because this incantation specifically in the Rotulus is found between a whole bunch of specific medicine for women while they are in labor, and also other treatments for bleeding women, like a whole, I would say like 30, 35 treatments. So it is interesting if you look
Like
through that
menstrual
perspective.
treatments?
Menstrual treatments, but also like specifically for like a whole bunch of different gynecological treatments,
Okay.
also for finding out whether or not the child will be a boy or a girl, a whole bunch of those kinds of treatments. And this adultery test is actually in that context in the manuscript, which is yeah, could definitely be related to something like that.
It is
Cool.
fascinating. So you said that you're specifically looking at animal ones. Is there any fun ones you can tell us
Oh,
about?
there are many fun ones. Yes. So
Yeah.
we could get into bee incantations, which is one of the genres I really like.
Okay.
And I guess I shouldn't go for one of the super long ones, but I can try to I can go for another one from the Rotulus, I guess, which I think is a really cool one. Wait, let's see. I think I have it somewhere here. Yes. Okay. So I am trying to translate on the go from Latin, so I might make a few mistakes, but
You're translating on the go from
Ah,
Latin?
I'm trying to at least. So when
what?
That is the best chill flex I have
Yeah,
heard
what
in
a flex.
my
Just
life.
great. So okay, I'm trying.
just absolutely put it in there. No, expected nothing back from it. Just like,
I love it.
casually translate from
So
line
what I'm
over
trying to
here.
say is that I might make some mistakes. So when bees like fly up to try and flee their swarm, you should run up to them with a closed fist and put it towards them and make a cross, and then you say, I'll say it in Latin and I'll translate it into English afterward. Domine Deus Noster, Quaentiut. Those are the letters. Domine Deus Noster means Lord, our Lord. So this again seems like a really cool kind of hidden incantation, right? Because you have this weird abbreviation there. What does that mean? What are these weird letters? This must be something really magical. That is, unless you know the Vulgate Latin translation of the Bible, because then you find out that these words actually form an abbreviation, which is Domine Deus Noster, quam admirabile est nomen tuum in universa terra, which means as much as Lord, our Lord, how admirable is your name in the entire earth, which, if your Bible knowledge is good, is Psalm 8 of the Bible. And this is even more relevant because Psalm 8 of the Bible discusses how how, at least in one of the lines, discusses how the Lord has given people power over animals. So in this way of trying to control the swarming process of bees, this monk or some cleric is using this specific quote from the Bible because he thinks that's going to be useful for trying to control his swarm of bees, which I think is, again, one of these wonderful examples of people using their extensive knowledge of these different kind of histories for super practical,
That's really cool. So like the
specific purposes.
too long didn't read version of that would be by the power of the Lord I command you.
Yes, but
Yeah.
not just by the power of the Lord, by the power of the Lord through this specific Bible passage that I know can be useful for controlling animals. That's what makes it, I think, even cooler, and shows that the people who are using this are not the weird magician in the woods or the scary witch somewhere far away, but the most
Holy
educated
shit,
people
Tim. That
in the
means that they're
community.
referencing.
Yes, yeah,
The incantations are referencing their sources.
yeah.
That's very cool. So they just run out with the fist in the air, very just like matter of fact, and make a cross with the
Yeah,
fist.
they make the sign of the cross with the fist, but they should also put it towards them. The thing with these texts is that the instructions are quite often in uh, interesting Latin, and also not like I don't know if they should put out the fist first, then make the sign of the cross, first make the sign of the cross, then put out the fist. I'm not entirely sure what the exact instruction is here. I think it may actually be we have a bunch of other bee incantations where you need to put earth in your or dust in your hand and throw that over the swarm, which modern research actually shows can uh, get a swarm to settle. So it may be that something like that is also related to it. But again, with these texts, with these incantations, we should always understand that what we're reading is probably not the entire ritual, but we're only reading a part of that ritual that was written down. So with something like this, it can be hard to exactly assess what's going on.
Wow.
It's so much fun.
Yeah, isn't it? Because it feels like this one in particular has no real real benefit to it, because a lot of the times you have stuff that kind of works because of some other method, like you said, with the dirt in the hand, you throw it and it the actual incantation doesn't work, but this little other thing that you do does work, so that kind of feeds back into the idea of the incantation working, similar to the one in between the breasts. If she doesn't say anything, then it kind of feeds into it. But this one just feels like you're just running around waving your fist at bees. I don't know how.
So quite often, what I think quite often with these, I mean, this one is specifically mentioned to be that you need to read it out. So I think maybe
so you're shouting at bees. You're
yes,
just like,
yes. So I mean, in order to understand this, we need to understand what swarming is. So swarming is the process where you have like your bee colony. It splits into two because it gets, I mean, very simplified. It gets too full. So a new queen starts looking for a new place to put that hive to produce a new beehive. This is a very scary process for a beekeeper. Nowadays, modern beekeepers have a whole bunch of good solutions for this, but in that time it used to be quite hard. So what you want to do as a beekeeper is have the bees settle somewhere nearby, so you can swoop them up and put them into a new beehive. So you now have two colonies that produce very important honey that you can make wax with and stuff like that. So this is a very important process to control. So you have a bunch of some incantations that you can read out, but you also have a bunch of things that I think are amulets that they place in these beehives, either to prevent the swarming altogether, or they place them in places where they hope the bees will settle, so they can swoop them up there and put them into the beehive. But again, I think these are we shouldn't think that beekeepers were just counting on singing an incantation. I think these are parts of broader things they're trying to do to get this swarm to settle, and they're just elements that can help in making this work, I think.
I mean, I feel like it's like having a bunch of tricks up your sleeve. It's like
and these are not tricks that like are kind of developing out of thin air. The idea that bees have a sense of hearing, and that you can control them by making certain sounds, because obviously incantations quite often are related to music. They are quite often in rhyme. The idea that you're saying them in a certain ritualistic way. But we have a bunch of ancient sources where they say that making certain noises during the swarming will help in controlling that swarm of bees, or luring them to a certain position. So the beekeepers that are doing this aren't doing this out of some kind of naivete or like dumb idea. They're doing this based on centuries old knowledge that they know to be true, which I think is fascinating. Whether or not it's useful for a modern beekeeper, I'm not entirely sure, but I think it was definitely useful for an 11th century beekeeper.
It's almost like you just throw enough things out there and one of them works, but you're not quite sure which one works. So you just like do.
Well, and they do seem to test them, and one of the ways you see this, which is I think the most interesting thing in it happens less with incantations, but more with recipes, is they will have what are called efficacy clauses. So at the end of a recipe or an incantation, they'll say probatum est, this is proven, or this is very helpful. And sometimes these efficacy clauses can be very long. So they'll be, if you don't believe that this recipe is going to work, so this kind of medical recipe for a certain disease, you should first test it out on a little piglet. And you will see with the piglet that it will help with him, and therefore it will also help on you. So it's more than just having a whole bunch of tricks up their sleeves. They are thinking about this in detail, and they just don't have the same scientific method that we do. But it's more than just a random set of tricks up their sleeves. These are ideas that are being developed for centuries, and that, at least for some people, are working in a sense.
Mm.
Well, what I meant more about the tricks up their sleeve, doesn't that I didn't mean for that to imply that it was ignorance based, but more as in, if this one doesn't work this particular time, I'll go to the other one. But good spot there, because that's not what I meant to say, but I see how it could have sounded like that. But I was also thinking, like, when you have those kind of like, this has been tested underneath, that made me think of like the toothpaste commercials when you see like 9 out of 10 dentists recommend.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, because this is wonderful, because something you see, something that's, again, with the social logic of text, it's something you quite often see is that we would think if you have like a book of recipes, you'd want to know, or of like medical treatments, you'd want to know who says that these things work, right? So you know that they're approved by the doctor. The idea of authority is very important. But with these texts, quite often, the authority will actually be lost. So something from a text by Hippocrates, or often pseudo-Hippocrates, the name will drop off, but these efficacy clauses that you would think don't necessarily serve a function, they will quite often stay and sometimes even become longer. So apparently this idea that a text tells you that it is proven holds a certain value for people.
Mm-hmm.
No, but I can see that. It's like checking out Amazon reviews before you buy something.
Yeah, it makes sense.
I always do it, and I always click the little thing that says, go to the worst review. I don't read the good ones. I always read the bad ones. You learn more from that, don't you?
100%. But that's really neat. Go ahead, Dan.
No, I'm saying these are fascinating. I want to know more. I want to hear more of these. What do you have one that stands out as your favorite other than the adultery one?
I mean, I feel like we are in the Nordic mythology podcast, so I feel like I should give you guys one that is actually, I would say, the one source where you could argue that it has something to do with Germanic paganism. I feel like I should give you that one. This is the incredibly famous second Merseburg incantation. And I think I have a translation here, because this is Old High German. I am not going to casually translate Old High German for you. Let's see.
You could have said you were.
I'll do that next time. Okay. Pol and Wodan were riding to the woods, and the foot of Balder's fall was sprained. So Sithgund, Sunask's sister, conjured it, and Freya, Vola's sister, conjured it, and Wodan conjured it as well as he could. Like bone sprain, so blood sprain, so joint sprain. Bone to bone, blood to blood, joints to joints, so may they be glued.
Wow.
I mean, at least the names give a very Norse mythology vibe.
Yeah. The Germanic. This is wonderful, because the famous Jacob Grimm, one of the Grimm brothers, calls this the biggest treasure ever found in a medieval library, a larger treasure than anything found in any other. And this is, of course, because this is a 10th century text, so it predates most of the things where. Most of the written texts, at least, where people from the Germanic pantheon, or gods from the Germanic pantheon, are mentioned by centuries, which is why so many scholars have had so many different mythological interpretations of these. The only little thing here, though, is that there's also an 8th century charm that mentions Juno and Hercules running into a horse, that horse spraining his foot, and them having to cure it. So
it could have been adopted.
Of course, no. I think that's true. But my point is more that this is this is a pretty regular thing in early medieval medicine. It is not something that the Germanic pagans are doing, and that in some kind of secret way ends up in a Christian manuscript. This is a completely legitimate, I would say, way of curing a horse. And what is super fascinating about it is that it contains these Germanic pagan gods' names, and how to interpret those. There are so many that there's one entire book, 300, I think over 300, maybe over 400 pages, that just talks about this text and the one short text before it. There have been so many different interpretations of these texts, and I think it's a wonderful example. It's such a unique example that makes it, I would say, deserving of all of this research.
The one thing that stood out for me from it was, did you say that was it Woden?
Yeah.
You said he does it as best he could, whereas the other two translators, they just do it
as well as he could. Yeah, is at least what the translation says. Yeah,
that seems quite
pretty underwhelming.
Yeah, like it's like the other two, it's just they do this, and for him, it's like he does it as good as he can, almost like, bless him, he's trying, which doesn't really fit with the idea of like the Odin figure being.
Maybe this is his one eye hanging from a tree days.
This was like his. Yeah, that's the one thing that stands out. Is there any explanation for that?
I assume that 6 books have been written about this exact question.
Oh, I'm sure that has.
And probably a bunch of people are comparing it to Wodan's depiction on, like, I don't know, drawings from the 7th century or something. And there must be a whole bunch of research on this, but I wouldn't know. I wouldn't know why that is. And again, this is me reading a translation. This is not me looking. I mean, of course I am looking at the text itself, but just now in front of me, I don't have the Old High German in front of me, so I don't know how it's formulated there. But it would be interesting to look at, and it would also be interesting to compare that to different versions or versions is a large word, but different similar incantations, and see where, for instance, Christian and Saint Stephen are being used in a similar sense, or again Juno and Hercules, whether or not they have similar wording there. That would be interesting to see. Maybe Wodan wasn't as powerful as people thought, something like that. It sounds like a wonderful article title.
It's getting a bit on in years, getting a little old, maybe.
It is just a fascinating way to word it. Like feels very like on purpose. Like we're gonna really hit home that he's trying his best, but it's not quite as good as the
Be patient
other two.
with him. He's doing.
I mean, it is written down, of course, by a Christian cleric in the 10th century. So at least 2 centuries after this area, I think it's written down probably around Fulda. So about 2 centuries after this area was Christianized. So maybe Wodan wasn't again, this is me joking around mostly. This is not my...
No.
Poor Tim sitting there, the medievalist going, yeah, Norse mythology, I totally know all of the nuances. Again, please don't ask me any follow-up questions.
I am someone looking at Latin manuscripts in early medieval Europe. I am not a Norse mythologist. This is joking more than academic interpretation.
But we really appreciate you pulling up that example just for the sake of the podcast.
Yeah,
I mean, really sweet
if people have been listening to me for an hour babbling all about a bunch of Latin incantations, I feel like I should give them a vote on at some point.
Yeah. I'm sure loads of people will have their opinions on it because it is a...
Oh, yeah, definitely. Apparently, I was at a conference recently in Germany. I read into this wonderful, I think, 80-year-old German lady. And she told me that she was actually taught this incantation in high school. Apparently, it used to be at least relatively common in Germany, because it's such a well-known. And another really famous one is the Lorsche Bienensegen, so the Lorsch bee blessing or bee incantation. That's also a relatively short Old High German poem that people get taught in high school. There in the Netherlands, we have a bunch of like the oldest Dutch poems that people will call them, that you will be taught in high school as well. And something, I mean, I guess in England you'll read like Beowulf or something. in a similar cultural sense.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, before we wrap up, is there one that stands out to you as either being really bizarre or weird or macabre?
Well, there
I don't
are a
know.
bunch of really weird ones, but that's just because the Latin is so weird that I don't know what's going on.
Okay. Are there
Uh,
any like the translate?
I can do a fun one to end with, which is a little nice lighthearted one that's circling back to the worms. And I think it's just a really cute one, and again a really short one. So when you see the waning moon, you put your left hand against your right cheek and your right hand against your left cheek, and you say, "New moon, new teeth. I spit out the rotten worms." You say this 3 times, and then you spit them out.
Aw,
I
someone
really
has
like
a
that
really
one.
bad toothache.
I think it's a really cute one. Yeah.
Oh, toothache sucks. Um,
I think that's one thing we take for granted. We'd be like, oh, the past. I wish I could have experienced it. I'm like, do you even want the chance of that toothache?
no, no.
Yeah, I mean, having to resort to something like this to solve it doesn't seem wonderful. No.
No, I just can't imagine it works either. Um, so is that just a case of, again, it feeds back to that what you said earlier about the worms eating
Yeah.
the cavities, I guess.
Yeah. 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 I mean, I thought it was a nice kind of rounding
Yeah.
off fun incantation.
See, that's another one that how has that survived? Because that kind of ever worked. So it's like, how has that kind of carried on and been known well enough to write down? Because
Yeah, well, I mean, I
kind of
guess
worked by accident, surely.
it's again gonna depend on how you define work, right? Like, and how I think to someone being used to modern dentistry, you immediately look at something like this and think, well, that's not gonna work, is it?
Hmm.
But it's for an early medieval doctor or an early medieval patient, maybe combining it with some herbs or something like that, or maybe just the toothache is getting better in a few days.
Power
I
of
think
placebo.
power
Yeah,
of
yeah,
placebo, of
okay.
course, is an element in there. Like the idea, obviously, these texts work because they survive for centuries and centuries and centuries, and they're being copied again and again. And for instance, the variations of the horse incantation I read to you are still found in 19th century Scandinavia, if we can believe the people who were running those surveys. But let's say they were still found in 19th, and the worm incantation we started with, the Nesso incantation, variations of that same kind of structure, not the same worm thing, but the same kind of incantation are found in 19th century Spain still. So these things, they work, right? That like they do, but for the people who are using them, I would never use them.
They might not work in the scientific sense that we expect them
yeah,
to.
yeah, but
Mm.
they work for the people who use them in a certain way, apparently.
Yeah, it gives the experience of having worked, but from a purely kind of a natural science based perspective, that's not necessarily how we would define it
Yeah.
as working, I
Even though
suppose.
recently I was having this discussion I'm at some kind of conference or something, and there was a musicologist there arguing that apparently there is now hard medical evidence that sometimes music can help in certain curing certain conditions, and of course incantations again quite often are related to music in some sense. So very optimistically,
Interesting.
maybe.
Oh,
Interesting.
I
yeah.
don't know how truthful that is, but I thought it was
No,
a
but no,
wonderful
but
wonderful.
I've seen the studies that show that at least that music has shown to have at least a soothing and perhaps maybe clarifying effect on Alzheimer patients.
Oh, yeah, yeah,
Mhm.
makes sense.
Yeah. And maybe
But I
Yeah,
even
was
just,
just oh, go ahead then.
I was gonna say just relaxing, if music can relax you to a point where your body can maybe just heal a little bit
yeah,
easier because without the tension and the fear and the and the kind of
Well, and
pressure.
in that sense, I really like the Heilung song that is about the Nesso incantation. It's not particularly my type of music, but I was reading, I encountered it because of my research, and I was reading the comments, and a bunch of people there were saying how the song was helping them through a tough time and through disease or stuff like that. So in that sense, you could say that the Nesso incantation still works today.
I like that.
Mm-hmm. So
I like that a lot.
I remember when we interviewed Heilung at Midgastblock a couple of years ago. Um, Maria was saying how I'm pretty sure it was Nesso. I'll have to go back and double check, but I'm pretty sure it was Nesso that through part of it, like she was actually in tears whilst recording it, and it was like part of. I think like it was triggered like by thoughts of like her dog Luna, which is that's very sweet, that little dog. But like so that emotion kind of maybe comes through in the song, and maybe that's why people connect to it so much because of that
Yeah.
like real life emotion that went into recording it.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe. And I was just thinking as a closing note about what you said earlier, Dan, about how could stuff like this possibly have survived if it didn't work. But then I was thinking about like how many different silly ways have we all been taught to get rid of the hiccups?
Mm-hmm.
And 9 out of 10 times, in my experience at least, these things don't work. It doesn't necessarily rid me of the hiccups. Do I try them all?
Yeah,
Or most of them every time still? I do, just on the off chance.
yeah, and that
Yeah.
one hiccups are so annoying that one time it works, you're just like, oh, thank fuck that's gone away.
And you're like, oh my God, that thing worked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And also we're living in our time of modern medicine. These have lasted for hundreds of years. We don't know if our version is going to last hundreds of years.
Oh no, Dan. No. Use modern medicine. That should be a
I was
that
literally
is
about
it
to
is
say that. I'm not saying
yes,
don't use
yes,
modern
no,
medicine.
modern medicine much better than centuries old incantations. Yes, 100%. Yes.
Okay, so if
But
anyone's going to take anything away from this, it's that please, guys, use modern, like traces of ancient and medieval medicine is cool and all, but stick to modern healthcare. That is
yes,
generally a good thing.
yes.
I was
I'm
just
saying that they
saying.
work in a way of trying to understand medieval culture, not in a way of promoting using texts
I
like these
know.
over your doctor. No.
I
I
love how stressed out you got there
I
for a
know.
second,
I
Tim.
promise that
Well,
I was
actually,
going to
our
disclaim that myself. I promise.
recently a Dutch book was published where like a bunch of us people from Utrecht discuss what we call weird things in manuscripts, so fun little things like this. And the first page is actually a huge disclaimer saying, "Do not try this at home," because my incantations you can probably try safely, but sleeping medicine using poppy seeds and wine maybe not the
Maybe
greatest
not.
idea. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, I was going to
Don't get
disclaim.
any ideas now, Dan.
No, I was just saying that we don't know if our medicine is going to last hundreds of years. I don't know.
That's
Oh no, we
true.
know that it's probably not going to last hundreds of years in the
Yeah,
same way because hopefully, as long as we keep funding science, it'll improve, and
yeah.
we hopefully our medicine will get better.
Maybe in 200 years there'll be someone on a podcast talking about our medicine in the same vein as we are talking about the incantations and charms.
I mean, probably, yeah, and about a bunch of other weird stuff. The way 21st century remedies for the hiccups sounds
Yeah.
like uh, a fun book about superstition in 21st century in the 21st century West.
Yeah, but I mean, how fortunate are we that like all of these remedies have probably lasted for hundreds and hundreds of years, depending on where you are and who you were and what your culture was. And then now we have the privilege of sitting there going like, "Oh, can you believe they did that in the 70s? How dumb were they?" And it's only 40 years ago. And it's like in the perspective of history, that's like at the speed of like sound almost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. We're very lucky to live when we do now. It's certainly in medicine terms. It's pretty safe to say we're in the best place in human history, probably.
100%.
Yeah. Okay. Let's wrap this up, and we'll let the the patrons ask you some questions, Tim. It's been a lot of fun. It's a little bit of a different pace for us. Obviously, we tend to stick to like the Nordic and Nordic mythology and Vikings. Not always. Like last week we did Doggerland, which was a lot of
Oh,
fun as
cool.
well.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's always nice to just look at different areas of the during this time period. And I think for most part, the people listening to the podcast just want to learn about cool stuff and like little different things that they don't normally get to pick up in everyday life and they might not come across. Oh yeah, this has been a lot of fun. Tim, is there anywhere you want people to follow you and like a social aspect? Do you have any like social media?
No, I'm not big on the whole social media thing. So
Okay.
not no, but like if you yeah, I hope to publish some fun articles soon. So read those, I
Mhm.
guess.
Will they go on academia?
Oh yeah, I should probably do that. That sounds like a good plan.
Yeah. Okay. Mags, what about you?
The times I do post on social media, it's on Instagram as usual. So that's Archeomegs, Archeo with a K.
Perfect. And then for me, it's Daniel_Iron1 or Hornsville, and then the podcast on all the different platforms. It's just Nordic Mythology Podcast. And as we said at the top of the show, if you can go and check out the Patreon, it's Patreon.com/Nordic Mythology Podcast. And if you can't, then a 5-star rating, positive review always helps new people find it, or just a simple like and share of one of our posts. Maybe somebody will come across it that's never seen the podcast before, and we can pick up some new people that way. So yeah, thank you very much, and let's let people ask you some questions.